hyponatremia, low sodium, and sodium is the most abundant positive ion in your blood plasma, in all of your extracellular fluids. Anybody remember the number, millimoles of sodium? 145. Okay. What's the osmolarity of blood plasma?
300.
300.
Or 290.
So it's pretty much half of all of the solutes. Not quite, almost half of all the solutes. So when we have low sodium, it's definitely going to impact our osmolarity. Okay. If we have low potassium or high potassium, it's going to have a very minimal effect. But sodium, because it's so abundant, big changes here mean something. Okay. So how do we think about this question? We're going to have a low extracellular osmolarity. What's going to happen as a result of that low extracellular osmolarity? What happens when that occurs? Yeah.
Water will be drawn to the higher osmolarity inside the cell.
Water is going to be drawn to the higher osmolarity inside the cell. That's right. So we're going to have water move from extracellular to intracellular, right? Is that right? Let's see, that is, what does that C? Why is, let's see, A is wrong because we're moving water in the opposite direction. What about B? What's going to happen to the total body osmolarity? It's going to go down, right? So the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid is already low, and as a result, water will move, right? And so as that water equalizes, what's going to happen is that the body overall is going to have somewhat of a lower osmolarity, not a higher. Okay. What would make D correct? The extracellular compartment is, what term would we use instead of hypertonic? Hypotonic, or we could also say hypoosmotic, okay, compared to the intracellular. Okay. At first, eventually it will reach an equilibrium and they'll be the same as one another, but the effects of that hyponatremia will be that overall we're going to have a lowering of the osmolarity. And how did that happen? Well, water has moved into our cells. Okay. Here is a picture that kind of illustrates that. Okay. Now, step one, or the first thing that happens, or things that we're describing, is we have a change in the osmolarity, goes down, right? Water moves from outside to inside of our cells. Okay. And the volume of our extracellular fluid is smaller. Okay, so we call this a volume contraction because we're always concerned with extracellular volume. Okay. Why? Because it affects the blood pressure. Primarily. Okay, and then our dotted line is lower than the original because the osmolarity overall is a little bit less. So, fancy term for this is hypoosmotic volume contraction. Hypoosmotic meaning there was an osmolarity change to the extracellular fluid, which was hypoosmotic. It's lower than it was before. And the volume contraction speaks to the fact that we're changing the extracellular fluid. Okay. The volume is small. Okay. So we're always very concerned with the extracellular, not because the intracellular stuff isn't important at all. It's just that these are things we can measure and we can measure the effects of them as well. Blood pressure, for example. Okay. Anybody have questions about these changes in osmolarity and their effects on the body? Put an example on Piazza. If you look at the last set of the questions that are in the last set of slides. There's a couple things for you to run through mentally to make sure you can answer those questions. Okay. So today, we are going to start talking about the heart, something we'll spend a few lectures on. We'll talk about the heart first today with regard to the electrical properties. We will get as far as talking about EKG, although we'll probably have to finish EKG next time. We'll talk about some of the mechanical events, which should be largely something you've learned already. We'll expand on it a bit. We'll talk about how the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems modulate the cell signaling in order to make the heart rate change and in order to make contractility change. So we'll be talking about lots of different things with regard to the heart. Okay. So for today, we're gonna talk about electrophysiology, meaning the electrical properties. So by way of review, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with the different parts of the heart in a very broad sense. So of course, you guys all know that you have two ventricles, right? Yes? Okay, good. We're on the right page. And left is right is left, right? Left? Right. Every time I show you the heart, you're going to have right on your left and left on your heart. Just imagine that you're dissecting me as I'm standing here, okay? So you're looking at a patient or you're looking at a cadaver when you're rehearsed anatomy last Sunday. That right is always over here, okay? Now, you know all that, and you also know what I'm going to show you here, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page because we have to understand the conduction system of the heart. There are two broad types of cells in the heart. We have the cells that contract and the cells that are purely for conduction, that is electrical conduction. Okay. So it all starts with the sinoatrial node, the SA node, which is found in what part of the heart? The right atrium. Okay, the sinoatrial node. And there's another node. This is the atrioventricular node, found between the atria and the ventricles. Yeah. Good. You're on fire. You got it. What's between them? There is a series of cells that run between them that are called the internodal pathway. Okay. And then after the AV node, we have a group of cells that are called the bundle of His. All right. Bundle branches, there are two, right and left, that run down which part of the heart? What do you call that? Sort of meet down the middle. Interventricular septum, okay? And then at the bottom, sort of radiating upward, sides of the ventricles, we have the Purkinje fibers, okay? All of these are considered conduction system elements or cardiac conduction system, right? Lots of different words for it, but essentially some sort of term to denote the fact that these have the very special role of conducting action potentials. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on action potentials in terms of propagation, but you'll remember that action potentials are these sweeping electrical events through cells, right? We'll look at characteristics for each of the different heart cells in just a moment. Okay, but I want to sort of hammer the point in here. We have two types of cells, okay? These cells are communicating with one another electrically, but what else are they doing? Right? We go SA node, internodal pathway, AV node, bundle pits, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. What else is happening electrically here besides action potentials running through the conduction system? We've got contraction, but what precedes the contraction? Let me put it this way. Contraction happens in contractile cells, right? Contraction does not happen in conduction cells. Okay. So how does this electrical activity affect a contractile cell? What's in between? What's going on? These action potentials that are propagated through the conduction system also spread through the contractile cells, right? Okay. So the SA node is largely responsible for stimulating the contractile cells of the atria. Okay. And then the AV node, once it's excited, will send signals down into the bundle His and in the bundle branches. And from there, as well as Purkinje fibers, we're going to stimulate the ventricular contractile cells. Okay. So electrical activities that we're watching up here have the primary job of stimulating electrical activity in contractile cells. Okay. And then what happens when the contractile cells have their action potentials? Then they contract, right? Okay, so there's electrical activity followed by contractile activity. This thing happens so fast, it's a little bit hard to see that the contraction is happening after electrical activity, but trust me, it does. Okay, so these are the conduction cells. Okay, and we're going to spend some time talking about the characteristics of the different action potentials. Okay, there's two different patterns that we see, and they're not identical from one part of the body to the one part of the heart to the next exactly, but they're similar. So we'll kind of bundle them together. On the left, we have the sinoatrial node. We have the AV node. Right? We've got the bundle branches and bundle of His. All of these conduction cells have this type of action potential. Okay, and the most important part of this is right down here, the pacemaker potential. Okay, and what is a pacemaker potential? How would you describe what that is? Yeah.
Isn't it like a slower depolarization, or gets you to the depolarization like
But it is a slow depolarization, right? So depolarization is any movement towards zero, right? From negative up to zero. So it's a depolarization, certainly, and it is slow. And the last thing you said was that it brings you to the depolarization, right? So when we think about action potentials in a neuron or a skeletal muscle cell, or even in the heart, they all have this characteristic of having a very sharp depolarization phase. Okay, I've circled it there. Here it's marked rapid depolarization. Okay. So we have a slow rising depolarization up to the depolarization. Okay, the rapid depolarization. Where's the resting membrane potential for these cells? Minus 70, minus 90. It's a trick question, somebody. You like a trick question. Where's the resting membrane potential? There isn't one, somebody says. Right. So these cells, they do have a baseline or a low point, okay? But they don't have a resting membrane potential. For a resting membrane potential to exist, it has to be resting, okay? It has to be stable. So over on the other side here, which we'll get to in a moment, minus 90, see there? There's a flat line for highlighted in blue for a little bit anyway. It has a resting membrane potential. Okay, a pacemaker potential is essentially a very, very leaky resting membrane potential, right? So it's allowing ions to flow through, and so it never really stabilizes, right? It's slowly rising. Okay? And why this is important is that this is what explains automaticity. Okay? That is the heart's ability to produce its own action potentials. Okay? So if we cut all nerves to your heart still beats, right? Okay, and this is why. And we see this type of activity in the SA node and the AV node, and we also see it in the next few parts of the conduction system. Okay. We get to the Purkinje fibers, they tend to look a little bit more like the contractile cells, but atria and ventricles primarily are going to have this other type of action potential. Okay. So at rest, they're at minus 90. Okay. What type of leak channels do you suppose they have if they're at minus 90? Potassium, right? How do you know that? Potassium's equilibrium potential, right? And what other types of leak channels are there? Probably not many of anything, right? If we had sodium, it would be less negative. Yeah. Okay, so we have a resting membrane potential. We don't have pacemaker potentials. Okay. We've got a depolarization. The plateau, you remember seeing this before probably in another class. There's a plateau where it stabilizes a little bit and then it drops off and repolarizes. Okay. So Purkinje fibers kind of fall into this camp rather than over the having pacemaker activity. Okay. In actuality, they're a little bit in between. They have a very slow pacemaker potential, but it's incredibly slow. Okay. Anyway, we can say in broad terms that we have conduction system on the left, contractile cells on the right. The conduction cells do not contract. They've got pathetic amounts of actin-myosin. Okay, so they essentially do not contract. On the right, they also conduct, no pacemaker, but they conduct on the right with the contractile cells. But their main job is to contract in response to that electrical activity. Okay. So the guys on the left, these nodal cells, you can kind of think of them as functioning as neurons, right? They're sending signals, they're stimulating other cells. Right? And on the right, we're acting much more like muscles with the contractile cells, okay? Having both electrical activity and contractile activity. Okay. All right, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the differences, but if you look at an SA node, people often call this the pacemaker, right? And its typical production of action potentials is about 80 per minute. Okay, that is without any sort of parasympathetic input, which would tend to slow it down a little bit. AV node, anybody know? Is it faster or is it slower? It is slower, yeah. So AV node is I'm going to make this number up. I think it's more like 100, 90 to 100. I don't remember exactly what it is. Bundle branches, bundle is much bigger, much longer. Okay. So what this means is that if all of these cells at time 0 begin to produce this pacemaker potential, okay, who's going to get up to that little dotted line threshold faster? SA node. Okay. So if they all begin at the same time reaching towards threshold for the big depolarization, the SA node gets there faster. Okay. So the SA node will determine the rate for the entire heart. Okay, because its action potentials are going to spread, and they'll get to the AV node before the AV node can even get to threshold on its own. Okay, so as soon as that action potential gets to the AV node, that AV node gets bumped up to threshold and has its potential. Okay. So the AV node does not dictate the rate of the heart under normal circumstances. Yeah.
So you said that AV node was slower, right?
Yeah.
So then what is the AV
What are you talking about? Thank you for the correction. I told you I was making these numbers up. Yeah, these would be action potentials per minute. Yeah. Sorry about that. I should have looked this. Nobody knows this stuff. Your cardiologist won't even know. Okay. So every time we have an action potential from that from the SA node, it's gonna reach these other parts of the heart before they get up there on their own, okay? Thank you for the correction, by the way, appreciate that. Any other questions? Does that make sense? Familiar with this concept? Yes?
Can you repeat what you said about increasing potential? Not many times.
About increasing what?
I heard you say something about increasing, like after the SA node, AV nodes, potential increase.
Okay, yeah, let me do that real quick here. So, let me explain that. If we have a heart, don't laugh, that's what it looks like. Okay, SA node at the top, AV node at the bottom, right? Okay, so if we, for example, let's say we wanna look at both of the action potentials, okay? So in the case of the left here is going to be times 0. Okay. The SA node. The SA node's pacemaker potential is going to look like that, and by comparison, the AV nodes might look like that. Okay. So in other words, the slope is less steep, right? So it's a lower slope. Okay. So the SA node at the top here. It is going to reach threshold, okay, at which point, and we'll talk about the channels, but at which point we start the depolarization, okay? That depolarization is something that is going to occur in the SA node, okay? And it's going to spread, right? Action potentials propagate, okay? And it is going to arrive at the AV node a little bit later, right? These things take time, but it arrives before the AV node gets to threshold itself, okay? So if you just had the AV node, what would happen is that your action potential would start here, okay? But because it's stimulated externally from another cell, it's like getting a jolt before it was allowed to get there on its own. What's going to happen is that instead, you'll have your action potential happen sooner. Okay. So the SA node and the AV node are going to have the same action potentials per minute under the control of the SA node. Okay. So if SA node is 80, AV node's also going to be 80 because it's being controlled by the SA node. Does that make sense? Okay. So these action potentials are sweeping across the heart that have originated in the SA node. They have not originated in the AV node. Okay. Even for those parts below the AV node, that action potential was initiated because of the SA node. Make sense? All right. Then, if you lose your SA node because you've had a heart attack, myocardial infarction, some cells die, sometimes they're contractile cells, sometimes it's electrical cells. If it's your SA node, you still have a secondary pacemaker. Okay, that AV node will take over, basically, because it's no longer controlled by the SA node. Make sense? Okay, so let's talk about this cardiac, yeah, go ahead.
If your AV node takes over, will you still contract your right atrium? Like, can the signals go backwards?
If my SA node is no longer working, the signals from the AV node go up. It depends on the heart. So generally, when you see this problem, the conduction is from the AV node downward. It tends not to spread upward, although it can. It's just not as common. I think it has to do with where it happens within the heart. Yeah.
So what would you do in that case? Like what
Moderate
the-
my activity.
Hmm?
What would I do? I would do no cardio. I'd probably not walk upstairs without help. You can live without your atrium functioning. Okay. They contribute something like 15% of the volume to your ventricles. Most of the time, the rest of your ventricular filling is passive, right? So your atria just sort of top them off. You're not going to run marathons. You're probably not even going to run upstairs. Walking upstairs, you'll feel it. Okay? Your heart will be racing. But you might live. life without running stairs? I don't know. I think it's pretty good, actually. Okay. So, I hate cardio. You guys do cardio, anybody? Yeah, good for you. It's really good for you. Once a month. You need about 3 hours a week to really have a big effect. Okay. Or whatever, something like it. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. How do we get this pacemaker potential? Well, you might guess that in order for us to go from -70 or -90 or someplace very negative, to move up towards -50, which is our threshold here, we're gonna have to add, we're gonna have to move some ions, right? And what we do is we move sodium ions. Okay? And sodium ions are going to go into the cell, so they're going to go from outside to inside, right, through a channel which gets this really cool name, hyperpolarization activated cyclic nucleotide gated. Okay. You like that? Otherwise known as HCN channels, better known as funny channels. Okay. And they're called hyperpolarization because a hyperpolarization is a drop or a low spot in the membrane potential. Okay. So where's the hyperpolarization? It's right here. Okay. We're dipping down, and we'll talk about why this happens. We got to start somewhere. These channels have the peculiar property, they are voltage gated channels, but they open in response to a low membrane potential, a negative membrane potential. Okay. You may have learned about sodium channels in neurons in the past, right? They open when you get to -55, right? You go up to -55 from down at -70. Well, this is the opposite, right? So it's the hyperpolarization, the more negative membrane potential that opens up the channel. Okay, so they're hyperpolarization activated. The cyclic nucleotide gated part is something we'll talk about in the next couple lectures. This is, do you know any cyclic nucleotides? Personally or otherwise? Have you heard of cyclic AMP? Yeah. Okay, so cyclic AMP, if you don't know it, you will later. Is a molecule that can activate this channel as well. So we'll talk about that. But what it does is it kind of modulates its permeability a little bit. Okay. It's called a funny channel because it opens at this hyperpolarization state. It's unusual. So what it does is it opens, and it's not a high permeability type of channel. It opens and sodium just kind of squeaks through, right? You don't get a flood of sodium, but sodium moves through. Why does sodium move through? Anybody? What's pushing sodium through? Chemical gradient. What else? Electrical gradient. Okay. Electrically, the inside of the cell is negative, right? Outside's positive. So a positive sodium certainly wants to go in, right? So that combined electrical and chemical gradient, or electrochemical gradient, right, is going to be in favor of moving the sodium in. Okay. What was the term we used last time to talk about the difference between these forces that want to push sodium in and the resting membrane potential? What? What? Yeah. Electrochemical driving force. Okay. So electrochemical driving force, that's the ECE, is the difference between our equilibrium potential of sodium, which is about plus 60, and where the membrane potential is. Okay, in this case it's minus 70 to start with. Okay. So that difference, what's the difference, Bob? math even. 130 millivolts, okay? That's what this is. Okay? The chemical and the electrical forces pushing it in. Okay, how big are those forces? 130 millivolts worth, okay? All right. So, we've got a funny channel, sodium channel, that opens up in response to our hyperpolarization. Okay. And as a result, we get a slow depolarization, which we call the pacemaker potential. Cool, right? All right. I hope this goes without saying. How many channels like that are on the cell? Multiple, okay? I'm gonna draw one. Assume there are a lot, okay? What else is here? Potassium leak channels. There are estimates that some cells have as many as 50 million sodium potassium pumps on their membranes. So we are talking about millions, if not tens of millions of these things, okay? So they're abundant, they're everywhere on the cell membrane. Okay. There's lots of them, not just one. But one will do for our purposes. Okay, so this continues. There is another channel, which is called a T-type calcium channel. T stands for transient. So is this one open for a long time or a short time? Short time, transiently, okay? And this is all of these channels we're gonna see are voltage gated, okay? So this rise in membrane potential that happens as a result of the funny channel stimulates the opening of the T-type calcium channel, okay? And so as a result of that T-type calcium channel opening, what can happen? What can go through a calcium channel? Calcium, okay? So calcium is gonna go in because there's more calcium outside than inside by a lot, okay? This will continue the pacemaker potential, okay? So the pacemaker potential is the result of two different channels, funny channels and T-type calcium channels. Okay? Then we have sort of the big daddy of all calcium channels. This is the L type. Okay. L stands for long lasting. Make sense? Great. I should have named them long and short, but long and transient will do, but no, right? Some people like to use big words. All right, so L type, long lasting. Okay, so what happens, it's not so much important in this case that it's long lasting, but one of the other characteristics of it is that it is highly permeable to calcium, right? So lots of calcium moves through. And again, down into electrochemical grade, just like sodium is doing. Okay, and this is what gives us that depolarization phase that's very typical of cells. Okay? In a neuron, this would not be calcium, but in this pacemaker cell, it's calcium. Okay. All right, so this, you can think of this as a series of cause and effect events, right? The hyperpolarization causes the opening of the HCN channel, okay? Which allows sodium to move through, which depolarizes the cell, right? Which causes the T-type channel to open. Calcium moves through, depolarizes further, which causes the L-type channel to open, right? So it's like setting off a chain reaction, mediated by these voltage changes along the way. Okay, so where is this happening? Pacemaker cells. Right? This is not happening in your atria or your ventricles. This is your pacemaker cells. Okay, last thing that happens is there's a voltage gated potassium channel, which is responsible for repolarizing the cell membrane. Okay, so it opens in response to a very high depolarization. Okay, there's only one threshold shown here as a dotted line, but you could imagine that for every one of these channels, they have their own threshold. Okay, so there's a threshold for opening threshold for opening up the HCN channels, and there's another threshold for opening up the T-type, right? The blue line's the L-type, and the potassium channels are stimulated by an even higher. So each channel has a different threshold. This is the voltage at which they open. Okay. All right, so potassium moves through, but it's going the opposite way, right? Why is it moving the opposite way? Okay, there's a concentration difference, and there's an electrical difference now too, right? So if we think of this in terms of its equilibrium potential, what's potassium's equilibrium potential? Told you you're gonna remember this stuff. Potassium's minus 90, right? And where is the membrane currently? More than 0. It's that. It's in the positive territory. Okay. So let's say it's plus 15 or something like that, right? So there's an electrochemical driving force that's pushing potassium down towards minus 90, right? Okay. So there's electrical and chemical forces that favor its movement. So all of these movements of ions can be explained by where is the membrane potential currently, and where is that ion's equilibrium potential, right? And if they're different, you're going to get movement of ions. Okay? That's why we spent time learning about those equilibrium potentials. In very conceptual terms, there are chemical forces and there are electrical forces, most of the time together, that push these ions across the membrane. Okay, so we've got 4 different types of channels here, and millions of them, right? There are 4 different types that are going to cause us to make this spontaneous action potential, right? With a depolarization phase, a repolarization phase, and then it starts over with that depolarization, leading ultimately to bottoming out, that hyperpolarization. Right? And what happens then? What happens when we get down there? We open up the HCN channel. Okay, start over. Okay, so this is happening lots of times per minute, right? Resting heart rate is somewhere between, it's like 70s average, 70, 80 is pretty normal. 60 to 80, as we are. Mine's slow, but I live slow. I talk fast. All right, so I'm gonna show you some lines. And I can't show you the lines and pull every question at the same time, so here it is again. This is a graph. It requires just a little bit of explaining. You've got time across the bottom. And each of these colored lines are moving up and down over time. And along the left, on the vertical axis, we have membrane permeability. Okay. So if you have no permeability